Welcome back to Mr. Nightgrim, my fellow travelers of the dark and unexplained. But before we begin our journey into these haunted hollows and cursed crossroads, I'm curious about you, my dedicated listeners. Where are you tuning in from tonight? What time is it in your corner of the world? Are you listening alone in the dark, or do you have the comfort of companions nearby? Tonight we're diving deep into the shadows that lurk in America's forgotten corners, those small towns where the impossible becomes inevitable, and where the line between reality and nightmare dissolves like morning mist. We'll be exploring 10 most terrifying true small-town horror stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the quiet places where people go to escape the chaos of the modern world. And here's something I always find fascinating. Have any of you experienced something you simply can't explain? Maybe it happened in your own small town, or perhaps during a late-night drive through unfamiliar territory. Share it in the comments, send me a message, because sometimes the most terrifying tales come from our own backyard. Now settle in, dim those lights, and prepare yourself for a journey through 10 locations where the ordinary world cracks open to reveal something far more sinister underneath. Let's go! The first thing I noticed about Millfield wasn't the boarded-up storefronts or the rusted-out cars scattered like grave markers across front yards. It was the silence. Even the wind seemed muted here, as if the hollow between these ancient Appalachian ridges swallowed sound whole. Uncle Ray met me at what used to be the main drag, a cracked strip of asphalt flanked by buildings that looked like they'd been slowly dissolving for decades. His handshake was firm, but his eyes held that hollow look I'd seen in too many men who'd watched their world disappear one factory closure at a time. "Appreciate you coming out, Danny," he said, leading me toward a rust-eaten pickup. "No, it ain't much of a vacation." The farmhouse sat at the base of Old Garrow Hill like a tumor. White clapboard siding had grayed to the color of dirty snow, and the wraparound porch sagged under the weight of rotting timber. Ray had inherited it from his wife's family. A place nobody wanted, but nobody could afford to abandon. "Been in the family since 1923, Ray explained as we unloaded my tools. "Built it right after they sealed up the old mine shafts. Coal company went bust, left the mountain looking like Swiss cheese. The basement reeked of mildew and something else, something acrid that burned the back of my throat." Ray's flashlight beam danced across stone walls, slick with condensation, revealing the source of our problem. A jagged crack running floor to ceiling, weeping rusty water onto the concrete. "Started about 6 months ago," Ray said. "Right after Martha passed. Funny timing, you ask me." I was running my hand along the fissure when my fingers found empty space. Behind a loose stone, maybe 2 feet square, was darkness. Ray's light revealed rough-hewn walls extending beyond our beam's reach. "Well, I'll be damned," Ray muttered. "Must be one of them old coal tunnels." But as we pulled away more stones, the acrid smell intensified. The tunnel walls weren't just dark, they were black, as if scorched by tremendous heat. I scraped at the surface with my knife, and charcoal flaked away in my palm. "Coal don't burn like that," I said. Ray's face had gone pale. "Maybe we should seal this back up." That first night, I woke to the sound of something sliding across concrete. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m., its green glow, the only light in the farmhouse's oppressive darkness. I crept downstairs, barefoot on cold linoleum, and descended to the basement. The tunnel opening gaped wider than before. A thin trail of fresh soil led from the mouth toward the basement stairs, as if something had been dragged or had dragged itself partway out before retreating. In the morning, I found Ray sipping coffee with shaking hands. "You hear anything last night?" I asked. "Nothing but wind," he said too quickly. I spent the day researching at the county courthouse. The mine records were spotty, but what I found made my skin crawl. The Garrow Hill operation had closed suddenly in 1923, after a series of incidents. 7 miners had gone missing in the deepest shafts. Search teams reported finding evidence of extreme heat, melted support beams, vitrified rock, but no bodies. More disturbing were the newspaper clippings. For months after the mine closure, residents reported strange sounds from beneath their homes. Scratching, sliding, the sound of something heavy being pulled through narrow spaces. That night I waited in the basement with Ray's shotgun across my knees. At 3:17 a.m. exactly, I heard it, a wet, grinding sound from deep within the tunnel, like massive millstones turning. The scorched walls seemed to pulse with each grinding revolution. Something was coming closer. I aimed my flashlight into the tunnel and saw them parallel grooves in the charred stone, worn smooth by decades of passage. Whatever had been emerging night after night was large enough to leave furrows a foot wide in solid rock. The grinding stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard breathing that wasn't mine. "Danny?" Ray's voice drifted down from upstairs, but it sounded wrong, stretched thin like he was calling from a great distance. I climbed the basement stairs and found the kitchen empty. The front door hung open, spilling cold mountain air across the threshold. Ray's coffee cup sat steaming on the table, as if he'd just stepped away. "Ray?" I called into the darkness. His voice answered from the basement. "Down here, Danny. Come see what I found." But Ray was outside somewhere. I was sure of it. I had just watched his empty kitchen, seen his abandoned coffee. The voice called again, patient and familiar. "Come on down, son. Don't want to keep it waiting." I stood at the top of the basement stairs, shotgun trembling in my grip, and realized the voice was coming from the tunnel. Not Ray's voice, something else. Something that had been listening to our conversations, learning the cadences and inflections of human speech. Something that had been practicing. Through the kitchen window, I saw movement on Old Garrow Hill. A figure stumbled between the bare trees, moving with the jerky gait of a marionette. Even at this distance, I recognized Ray's flannel shirt, his silver hair catching moonlight. But Ray was calling to me from the basement, his voice growing more insistent. "Danny, you need to see this. It's beautiful down here. Martha's here too. She's been waiting." I ran. I left everything, tools, clothes, Ray's truck keys, and sprinted down the gravel road until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. When I finally looked back, the farmhouse was dark, except for a faint orange glow seeping through the basement windows. The next morning, state police found me babbling beside the highway. They drove me back to the farmhouse, where they discovered the basement tunnel had collapsed, sealing itself with tons of stone and earth. Ray was never found. The official reports cited a gas leak explosion, but I know better. Sometimes late at night I still hear that grinding sound closer now, as if the thing beneath Old Garrow Hill has learned to travel farther from home. And sometimes in the space between sleep and waking, I hear Ray's voice calling my name, asking why I left him behind. The radio crackled to life at 3:09 a.m., just like it had every night for the past 3 weeks. "Help me, please. I can't get out." I jerked the wheel of engine 47, nearly sending us into the ditch that ran alongside Meadowbrook Road. The static-laced whisper faded as we passed the old Peterson place, leaving only the hum of the diesel engine and my partner Jake's snoring from the passenger seat. Third time this month we'd been called out to a grass fire that turned out to be nothing, just Mrs. Kowalski's overactive imagination and a case of insomnia. But it wasn't the false alarms that kept me awake. It was the voice on Channel 9, always the same words, always at the exact same spot on this godforsaken stretch of Montana highway. 23 years I'd been volunteering with the Bitter Creek Fire Department, and I'd never heard anything like it. Our radios were digital now, crystal clear, but that voice came through wrapped in the kind of analog static I remembered from my grandfather's CB setup. "Help me, please. I can't get out." Jake stirred as I pulled into the station. "Radio acting up again?" "Just interference." I lied. But I knew it wasn't interference. The voice belonged to Sarah Hendricks, the 17-year-old who drowned in Peterson's Meadow during the flash flood of 2008. I'd been there that night, had pulled her little brother from the rushing water while she got swept downstream into the culvert. We'd searched for hours, but the current had been too strong, the water too deep and fast. They'd found her body 3 days later, tangled in debris 2 miles downstream. I'd never forget her voice, the way she called for help as the water rose around her car, the desperation cutting through the storm static on her old analog radios. She'd been trying to drive to her job at the truck stop when the wash filled faster than anyone expected. "Help me, please. I can't get out." The same transmission we'd received that night 15 years ago, her voice growing fainter until the static swallowed it completely. The next evening, I drove out to Peterson's Meadow alone. The old man had sold the land to the county after the flood, and they'd installed better drainage, but the place still gave me the creeps, especially at night when the wind rustled through the cattails and made them sound like whispers. I parked at the edge of the access road and waited. The radio remained silent until 3:09 a.m., when the familiar crackle filled the cab. "Help me, please. I can't get out. This time I keyed the microphone. Sarah? Sarah? Is that you? The static intensified, and for a moment I thought I'd lost her. Then her voice came back, clearer than before. Tom? Tom Morrison? Oh God, Tom. You have to help me. I'm still in the car. The water, it's so cold, and I can't get the door open. My hands shook as I gripped the radio. Sarah, you're not in the car anymore. That was 15 years ago. You died that night. No, that's not right. I can see the headlights under the water. The radio's still working. I called for help, but nobody came. Nobody came, Tom. I tried to reach you, I whispered. We all tried. The current was too strong. The water's getting higher. It's up to my neck now. Please, Tom, don't let me drown again. The transmission cut to static, leaving me alone in the truck with my racing heart and the smell of rain that hadn't fallen in weeks. I started researching the next day, digging through old newspapers and county records at the library. Mrs. Patterson, the librarian, remembered the flood well. It had been the worst natural disaster in the county's history. But when I asked about Sarah Hendricks, her expression grew troubled. Strange thing about that girl, she said, lowering her voice. They never did find her car. What do you mean? I thought, found her body downstream, sure enough, but the car vanished. Some folks figured it got buried under all that sediment the flood washed down, but, she shrugged. County dragged that culvert every year for a decade, never found so much as a bumper. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Sarah's voice, the way she'd said, "Don't let me drown again." By 2:30 a.m., I was in my truck, driving toward Peterson's Meadow with a sick certainty in my gut. The meadow looked different in the pre-dawn darkness. The drainage ditches cast sharp shadows, and the new culvert entrance yawned like a mouth. I parked and walked to the spot where Sarah's car had supposedly gone under, my flashlight beam dancing across the marshy ground. At 3:09 a.m. exactly, my portable radio erupted with static. Tom? Are you there? I can see your light. You're right above me. I looked down at my feet and saw it, a depression in the earth, roughly car-shaped, filled with stagnant water that reflected my flashlight beam like black glass. I've been calling every night, but nobody hears me except you. The car's still here, Tom. I'm still here. Sarah, what do you want me to do? The door's jammed. I need you to break the window. I need you to pull me out. I knelt beside the depression and plunged my hand into the cold water. My fingers found nothing but mud and rotted vegetation, but Sarah's voice grew more desperate. Hurry, Tom. The water's over my head now. I can't hold my breath much longer. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I waded deeper into the depression. The water was impossibly cold, and I could feel the current tugging at my legs, a current that shouldn't exist in a shallow marsh. My hand touched metal, smooth, curved glass that could only be a car window. That's it. You found me. Break the glass, Tom. Get me out of here. I raised my flashlight like a club, but in its beam I saw something that made my blood freeze. My own reflection stared back from the window, but behind it, pressed against the glass from the inside, was Sarah's face, pale, desperate, mouth open in a silent scream. Don't leave me again, Tom. Please don't leave me again. The radio fell from my numb fingers as I stumbled backward. The depression began to bubble and churn, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. Frost spread across the marsh grass, and my breath came out in panicked puffs. I ran. I left the radio, left my dignity, and ran like hell back to the truck. As I fumbled with the keys, I heard Sarah's voice one last time, not from the radio, but from the air itself. You're just like the others. You're going to let me drown. The engine finally caught and I peeled out, spraying gravel and marsh water behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the station, where I sat in the parking lot until dawn, trying to convince myself it had all been a hallucination. But 3 nights later, at 3:09 a.m., my radio crackled to life again. Only this time, Sarah wasn't alone. Another voice joined hers, male, younger, desperate. Help us, please. We can't get out. I recognized that voice too. Billy Kowalski, Mrs. Kowalski's grandson, who'd gone missing last month while hiking near Peterson's Meadow. His body had never been found. Now I know why Mrs. Kowalski keeps calling in those false alarms. She's not seeing grass fires. She's seeing the lights from all the cars that never made it out of Peterson's meadow, still flashing their hazards beneath 20 feet of mud and time, still calling for help that will never come. And every night at 3:09 a.m. their voices grow a little stronger. The Dusty Spoon had been closed for 18 months when I inherited it, and it looked every day of it. Tumbleweeds had collected against the front door, like nature's own barricade, and the neon sign that once promised best pie this side of Vegas hung dark and crooked above windows hazed with desert grit. Grandma Rose had run the place for 43 years, serving coffee and comfort food to truckers, transients, and the handful of locals who still called Perdition Nevada home. Population 127, according to the sun-bleached sign at the town limits, though I suspected that number was optimistically high. The diner sat on the north edge of town like a chrome and glass monument to better times, when Route 38 still carried traffic and the nearby silver mine hadn't yet played out. Now it was just another roadside relic slowly being reclaimed by the Mojave, but it was mine, and I needed the fresh start more than I needed common sense. I'd been cleaning for 3 days when I first heard the knocking. It came from the kitchen, a hollow metallic sound like someone tapping on steel with their knuckles. When I investigated, I found nothing but dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight and the massive walk-in freezer that dominated the back wall. The freezer had been sealed since the health department closed it in 1987. A thick bead of industrial welding ran along the door frame like a scar. Grandma Rose had never talked about why they'd shut it down, just muttered something about that damn drifter whenever anyone brought it up. Knock. Knock. I pressed my ear to the freezer door and heard only the tick and ping of old metal settling. Probably just thermal expansion, I told myself. Dessert temperature swings could play hell with aging equipment. But the knocking came again the next afternoon, and the afternoon after that, always the same rhythm, always from inside the sealed freezer. I mentioned it to Earl Cosey at the hardware store when I went in for cleaning supplies. "Ah, hell," Earl said, his weathered face creasing into a frown. "That old thing's been making noise since they welded it shut. Your grandma complained about it for years." "Any idea why they sealed it?" Earl's expression grew guarded. "Health department business. Better left alone, you ask me." That evening I drove to the Perdition Public Library, a generous name for the double-wide trailer that served the town's literary needs. Mrs. Hendricks, the librarian, was a tiny woman with steel-gray hair who'd probably card-cataloged every book personally. "You're Rose's granddaughter," she said before I could introduce myself. "Heard you were fixing to reopen the Spoon." "Trying to. I was wondering if you had any old newspaper archives. Something from 1987? Her pale eyes sharpened. "What exactly are you looking for?" "Just want to understand what happened with the health department closure." Mrs. Hendricks disappeared into the trailer's back room and returned with a manila folder thick with yellowed clippings. "Your grandmother made me promise never to show these to tourists," she said, "but family's different." The headline of the Perdition Weekly Gazette from August 15, 1987, made my blood chill. "Drifter found dead in diner freezer." According to the article, a transient named Marcus Pell had been discovered frozen solid inside the Dusty Spoon's walk-in freezer on a Tuesday morning. The door had been locked from the outside, and the temperature logs showed the unit had been running continuously for at least 72 hours. Accidental death, the coroner had ruled, suggesting Pell had entered the freezer while intoxicated and become trapped when the door sealed behind him. But the article hinted at inconsistencies, scratches on the interior walls, damage to the door handle that suggested someone had tried desperately to get out. More disturbing was a follow-up piece from 2 weeks later. Diner freezer sealed after persistent disturbances. Apparently, customers and staff had complained about knocking sounds coming from inside the freezer, even after Pell's body had been removed, and the unit had been thoroughly cleaned. Knock. Knock. The sound followed me home that night, echoing in my memory long after I'd locked the diner and driven to the rundown motel where I was staying. I lay in bed listening to the desert wind rattle the windows, and wondered what kind of desperation would drive a man to lock himself in a freezer. Or what kind of fear would drive someone else to lock him in. The next morning I found the diner's front door standing wide open. I was certain I'd locked it. I'd checked twice, the way you do when you're alone in a strange place. But the desert wind had blown sand across the threshold, and everything inside was filmed with grit. It took me an hour to sweep out the dining room and reset the mousetraps. That afternoon the knocking was louder and more insistent, seemed to follow me around the kitchen, always just behind whichever wall I was working near. When I stopped to listen, it stopped too. When I resumed cleaning, it started again. Knock, knock, knock. I decided to ignore it, but by evening my nerves were frayed. I was washing down the prep tables when I heard something new, a scraping sound like fingernails on metal. It was coming from inside the freezer. I pressed both palms against the sealed door and felt vibration thrumming through the steel. Something was moving in there, moving with the restless energy of a caged animal. "Marcus," I whispered, feeling foolish even as the word left my mouth. The scraping stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard my own heartbeat and the distant hum of the highway. Then, so faint I almost missed it, came a voice. "Cold, so cold." I jerked my hands away from the freezer door and stumbled backward. The voice had been muffled by inches of steel and insulation, but unmistakably human, unmistakably desperate. "Please let me out." My rational mind insisted it was impossible. Marcus Pell had died 36 years ago. His body had been removed, buried, presumably at rest. There was no way he could be inside that freezer, no way he could still be speaking. But the voice came again, clearer now. "I didn't mean to take the money. I was hungry. So hungry. Please don't leave me in here." Money. The newspaper hadn't mentioned any theft, but maybe that was the real story. Maybe Marcus Pell hadn't accidentally locked himself in the freezer. Maybe someone had put him there, left him to freeze while they decided what to do about a drifter who'd stolen from the till. Knock. Knock. The sound was frantic now, like someone pounding on the door with both fists. I could hear him crying, could hear him begging. "I'll give it back. I'll leave town. Just please, Rose. Don't leave me in here. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Rose. My grandmother's name. I ran. I left the lights on, left the mop bucket sitting in the middle of the floor, and ran for my car. But as I fumbled with the keys, I heard him calling after me through the diner walls. "Don't go. Please don't go. I've been waiting so long for someone to hear me." I spent that night in my car outside the motel, afraid to go inside, afraid to be alone with my thoughts. When dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky the color of dried blood, I drove back to the Dusty Spoon with a crowbar and a sledgehammer. If Marcus Pell was somehow still in that freezer, I was going to let him out. The welding had been professional work, but 36 years of desert heat and cold had made the metal brittle. It took me 2 hours to crack the seal and pry open the door. Ancient cold poured out, impossibly frigid air that should have warmed decades ago. The freezer was empty except for a pair of work boots and a wallet lying on the floor. I opened the wallet with trembling fingers and found Marcus Pell's driver's license, along with a folded $20 bill and a note written in my grandmother's careful handwriting. "I'm sorry. I didn't know what else to do. You were going to tell them about the books, about how I'd been skimming to pay for Mama's medicine. I just meant to scare you, make you understand what was at stake. I never meant for the door to stick. I never meant for you to die in here. Forgive me." That night, for the first time in 36 years, the Dusty Spoon was quiet. No knocking, no scraping, no desperate voice calling for help. Marcus Pell was finally free. But now I understand why my grandmother left me the diner. It wasn't an inheritance, it was a confession. And sometimes, late at night when the desert wind howls through the empty dining room, I hear her voice joining his, both of them apologizing for secrets that should have stayed buried. Both of them knocking, trying to get out. The rental cabin sat like a broken tooth against the white expanse of Whistler Lake, 40 miles from the nearest neighbor and a lifetime away from the city noise that had been slowly driving me insane. I'd come here to finish my book, to find the silence that had been eluding me for months, but I hadn't counted on the dreams. Or the walking. The first time it happened, I woke to find my feet caked with snow and ice, my pajamas soaked through from the knees down. I was standing in my own living room, shivering and disoriented, with no memory of how I'd gotten there or where I'd been. The cabin's front door hung open, spilling Arctic air across the hardwood floors. I'd never been a sleepwalker. 34 years of sleeping in beds from Brooklyn to Beijing, and I'd never once left my mattress without being consciously aware of it. But the evidence was impossible to ignore. Wet footprints leading from the door to where I stood, and beyond that a trail of bare footprints in the snow leading toward the frozen lake. The tracks stopped at the shoreline, as if I'd simply vanished into the ice. Dr. Yates at the Whitefish Clinic blamed the altitude and isolation. "Stress manifests in different ways," she said, prescribing sleeping pills that made me groggy but didn't stop the walking. Maybe you should consider heading back to the city. But I couldn't go back. Not yet. The book was finally coming together, and the silence of Whistler Lake was exactly what I needed to hear the story trying to tell itself. I just had to solve the sleepwalking problem. I started setting precautions. I moved the coffee table in front of the door and scattered pots and pans around it, creating a noise trap that would wake me if I tried to leave. I went to bed wearing my heaviest boots, laced tight and double knotted. It didn't matter. The second time I woke on the ice itself. I was maybe 100 yards from shore, standing barefoot on the frozen surface in nothing but my thermal underwear. My breath came in sharp puffs and my feet had gone numb past the point of pain. Above me, the aurora borealis writhed like luminous snakes, casting green shadows on the ice. I had no memory of leaving the cabin, no recollection of walking across the snow or stepping onto the lake. But behind me, a clear trail of footprints led back to shore. My footprints, each one distinct in the virgin snow. What terrified me was what lay ahead. The prints continued deeper onto the lake, marching in a perfectly straight line toward the dark water that showed through the ice near the center. But these prints weren't mine, couldn't be mine because I was standing where my conscious journey had ended. Yet they matched my feet exactly. Same size, same gait, same distinctive wear pattern from an old ankle injury. They were my footprints, but they continued for another 200 yards into the darkness, finally disappearing at the edge of the open water. I followed them. The ice groaned under my weight as I traced the impossible trail. Each step felt like walking on the edge of a blade, the frozen surface flexing and creaking with sounds like whale songs. The footprints were crisp and clear, as if they'd been made moments before, despite the fact that it hadn't snowed in 3 days. At the water's edge, the prints simply stopped. No signs of a struggle, no broken ice, just bare footprints ending at the liquid boundary, as if their maker had stepped off the world entirely. I spent the next day researching the lake's history at the county courthouse. Whistler Lake was a glacial formation, nearly 400 feet deep at its center, fed by underground springs that kept portions of it from freezing even in the harshest winters. It had claimed 17 lives over the past century, mostly fishermen who'd misjudged the ice thickness or hunters who'd fallen through in the dark. But one case caught my attention: Michael Santos, age 36, a writer from Seattle who'd rented the same cabin I was staying in. That was 7 winters ago. According to the sheriff's report, Santos had been found on the ice one morning, frozen solid, wearing only his underwear. His footprints led from the cabin straight to where his body was discovered, but search teams had found another set of identical prints continuing toward the open water. The report noted it as an oddity but offered no explanation. That night, I took more extreme precautions. I zip-tied my ankles to the bed frame and swallowed 3 sleeping pills. I placed a digital camera on the nightstand, set to take a photo every minute throughout the night. I still walked. The camera captured everything. Frame by frame, it documented my impossible journey. The zip ties somehow loosened around my ankles, my unconscious body rising from bed like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. My eyes open but completely vacant as I walked toward the door. In frame 247, I was leaving the cabin, moving with the mechanical precision of a programmed automaton. In frame 248, I was gone. Frame 249 showed an empty cabin. Frame 250 showed me returning, clothes soaked, feet blue with cold, but my face wearing an expression I'd never seen in any mirror, a smile of profound satisfaction as if I'd completed some essential task. I reviewed the footage a dozen times, but it told me nothing about where I'd gone or what I'd done during those missing hours. All I knew was that each night the compulsion grew stronger, and each morning I found myself closer to the open water at the lake's center. On the 5th night, I didn't set any traps. I didn't take pills or tie myself down. Instead, I lay in bed and waited, forcing myself to remain conscious as the familiar pull began tugging at my mind like a fishhook drawing me toward the door. This time I wanted to remember. The walking felt like floating, like being carried by invisible currents toward an inevitable destination. My body moved without my conscious direction, stepping surely across the snow and onto the ice, while my mind drifted in a strange, peaceful haze. But underneath the peace was something else. A voice that wasn't quite my own, whispering directions. Straight ahead. Don't stop. Almost there. Just a little farther. As I approached the open water, I began to see shapes beneath the ice. At first, they looked like shadows, dark forms moving in the lake's depths. But as I got closer, they resolved into something far more terrifying. Bodies. Dozens of them suspended in the black water like specimens in formaldehyde. Men and women of all ages, all wearing the same vacant expression I'd seen in my camera footage, all perfectly preserved by the frigid depths. And at the center of the group, treading water as if the liquid weren't cold enough to kill in minutes, was Michael Santos. He looked exactly as he had in his driver's license photo. 36 years old, brown hair, the soft build of a man who spent his days behind a desk. He smiled when he saw me and raised one pale hand in greeting. "Join us," his voice whispered inside my head. "The water's not cold once you get used to it, and you'll never have to worry about finishing that book. You'll never have to worry about anything again." The other bodies began to move, rising toward the surface with their arms outstretched. I could see the peaceful expressions on their faces, the complete absence of fear or pain. They looked happy, fulfilled in a way I'd never been in life. I was raising my foot to step into the water when something inside me rebelled. Maybe it was the sight of Michael Santos's smile, too wide, too knowing, or maybe it was the realization that I was about to become another mystery for the next renter to discover. I turned and ran. Behind me I heard them calling, not with voices, but with a psychic pull that made my bones ache and my vision blur. Every step away from the water felt like tearing something vital from my chest, but I kept running until I reached the cabin and slammed the door behind me. I left the next morning, abandoning my book and my deposit and my dreams of finding peace in the wilderness. As I drove away, I could see figures standing on the ice in my rearview mirror, watching my retreat with disappointment. I moved back to the city, back to the noise and chaos I'd been trying to escape. But sometimes on the coldest nights, I still feel the pull of Whistler Lake drawing me north. In my dreams, I walk barefoot across snow and ice toward dark water filled with smiling faces. And sometimes I wake up to find my feet wet and cold, even though I'm 3 floors up in a downtown apartment building miles from the nearest body of water. The lake remembers me, and sooner or later, I know I'm going to remember it back. The dashcam never lied. In 18 months of driving delivery routes through the Colorado Rockies, that little black box had recorded everything from elk crossing the highway to spectacular sunrise views over the Continental Divide. It was my insurance policy, my witness to the long miles and empty roads that made up my workdays, which was why the missing footage made no sense at all. I'd been making the weekly run to Leadville, a straightforward haul up Highway 285 through South Park and over the Arkansas River Valley. The route included a narrow bridge spanning Willow Creek Canyon, a white-knuckle crossing on a good day, with 100-foot drops on either side and barely enough room for 2 vehicles to pass. I remembered approaching the bridge in clear weather, the autumn sun slanting through my windshield as I downshifted for the crossing. I remembered the metal grating under my tires, the way it always made my teeth ache. I remembered checking my mirrors for oncoming traffic. And then I was on the other side, pulling into the Leadville truck stop with my hands shaking and my heart racing like I'd just run a marathon. The timestamp on my dashcam showed a 10-minute gap. At 2:17 p.m. I was approaching the bridge. At 2:27 p.m. I was climbing out of my cab at the truck stop, 14 miles down the road. But those 10 minutes in between, the most dangerous part of the drive, were completely missing from the memory card. More disturbing was the condition of my truck. The entire cab was splattered with red mud, thick clay that clung to the windshield and side panels like dried blood. It was in my wheel wells, my grille, even coating the mirrors and antenna, but it hadn't rained in 3 weeks, and the nearest clay deposits were 40 miles south near Alamosa. I'd driven through something, or something had driven through me. At the truck stop, I cornered Jake Mendez, a local driver who'd been running these routes since before I was born. "Ever lose time on the Willow Creek Bridge?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Jake's weathered face went pale. "You too, huh?" "What do you mean, me too?" He looked around the diner, making sure we weren't overheard, then leaned across the table. "Happened to me twice in the past year, both times coming from the south, just like you. I'd be cruising along, hit that bridge, and next thing I know I'm 5 miles past it, with no memory of the crossing." "Any mud on your truck?" "Red as paint. But here's the weird part. I checked with the highway department, asked about construction or mudslides that might explain it. They said the bridge has been clean for months." Jake wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, I quietly asked around at truck stops and diners throughout the valley. The stories were always the same. Experienced drivers approaching the Willow Creek Bridge would lose chunks of time, arriving at their destinations with no memory of the crossing and their vehicles caked in mysterious mud. Most blamed fatigue or altitude sickness, but I knew better. I'd been wide awake, completely alert, and the altitude shouldn't affect someone who'd been driving these mountains for over a year. I decided to investigate. The following Tuesday, I loaded my truck with an empty trailer and made the same run, but this time I was prepared. I'd installed a backup camera system with 3 different recording devices, positioned GPS trackers in hidden locations, and even wore a body camera clipped to my shirt pocket. The approach to Willow Creek Bridge looked exactly as I remembered. Narrow asphalt ribbon stretched across the canyon, metal guardrails gleaming in the afternoon sun. But as I drew closer, something felt wrong. The shadows seemed deeper than they should be, and the air shimmered with heat distortion, despite the cool October weather. At exactly 2:17 p.m., I reached the bridge approach. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in my cab at the Leadville truck stop, staring at my hands in confusion. My clothes were damp with sweat, my mouth tasted like copper, and every muscle in my body ached as if I'd been wrestling with something large and resistant. All 3 camera systems showed the same 10-minute gap. The GPS trackers had recorded impossible readings, coordinates that placed my truck simultaneously at the bridge, in the canyon below, and somehow 200 feet above the roadway. The body camera had captured only static, and a low rhythmic sound like heavy breathing. But this time I had something else. In my shirt pocket, crumpled and stained with that same red mud, was a note written in my own handwriting. "Don't look down. Keep driving. It's not real. None of it is real. The bridge isn't there anymore." I had no memory of writing it. That night, I researched the bridge's history at the county archives. Willow Creek Bridge had been built in 1987 to replace an older wooden structure that had collapsed during spring floods. But buried in the construction reports was a disturbing detail. The original bridge hadn't just collapsed, it had vanished. According to witness statements, the wooden bridge had been there one morning and simply gone by afternoon, leaving no debris in the canyon below. Construction crews found no evidence of the missing structure, as if it had never existed at all. The new concrete bridge had been built in the exact same location, using the same approach roads and abutments. I drove out to the bridge that night, parking on the south approach with my headlights aimed across the span. In the darkness, the structure looked normal. Concrete deck, steel guardrails, regulation reflectors marking the lanes. But when I trained my binoculars on the far side, something was wrong with the perspective. The road seemed to curve away at an impossible angle, as if the bridge connected to somewhere else entirely. And in the beam of my headlights, I could see marks in the concrete, deep gouges that looked like claw marks, as if something massive had dragged itself across the surface. At 2:17 a.m., exactly 12 hours after my missing time episode, I heard engines. A convoy of vehicles was approaching from the north, trucks, cars, even what looked like an old-school bus. But as they reached the bridge, they began to change. The asphalt beneath them shifted and rippled like water, and the vehicles themselves became distorted, stretching and compressing, as if viewed through a funhouse mirror. One by one, they disappeared into the distortion, vanishing as soon as they reached the bridge's center, but their headlights continued moving through the canyon below, following a road that didn't exist, carrying passengers who couldn't possibly survive. I was watching a highway that existed in 2 places at once. The real bridge built in 1987, and the phantom road that had taken its place when the original structure vanished. Every day at 2:17 p.m., the 2 realities overlapped for exactly 10 minutes, and anything crossing during that window got caught between worlds. The red mud wasn't clay at all. It was the residue of existing in 2 places simultaneously, the physical evidence of occupying space that wasn't entirely real. I never drove that route again. I transferred to routes that kept me in Kansas and Nebraska, far from the impossible geometries of the Colorado Rockies. But sometimes, when I'm driving through perfectly normal terrain on perfectly normal roads, my dashcam will show a 10-minute gap and I'll find my truck covered in red mud that shouldn't exist. The bridge at Willow Creek isn't finished with me. It's still trying to drag me down into that phantom road, where the headlights never stop moving, and the passengers never reach their destinations. And every time I close my eyes, I can feel those 10 missing minutes calling me back. The Pinecrest Tower had been abandoned for 3 years when the Forest Service assigned me to it, a skeletal metal structure that clawed 40 feet into the Idaho sky like a desperate prayer. Budget cuts had shuttered most of the old lookout posts, replacing human eyes with satellite surveillance and computer algorithms that could spot smoke signatures from space. But the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness was different. Too much territory, Too much interference from the terrain, too many blind spots where a fire could smolder for days before anyone noticed. They needed someone up there, even if it meant reviving a facility that had been written off as obsolete. I didn't mind the isolation. After 22 years working urban fire departments, the silence was a blessing. No sirens, no traffic, no constant radio chatter, just wind through the pines and the occasional whisper of wildlife moving through the underbrush 40 feet below. The tower's equipment was older than me. The radio was a 1970s era unit with analog dials and a handset that crackled with static even when no one was transmitting. The forest phone was even more ancient, a direct line system that connected to ranger stations through miles of copper wire strung between trees. Both systems had been dead for years, according to my supervisor. Don't even bother with them. Ray Castellanos had said during my orientation, "We'll issue you a satellite phone for emergencies. The old gear is just too unreliable." Which was why I was surprised when the forest phone started working on my third night. I was updating my log when I heard the distinctive ring, not the electronic chirp of modern phones, but the mechanical bell sound that belonged to rotary dial era. I lifted the heavy Bakelite handset and heard nothing but static, the kind of white noise that used to fill dead air on AM radio stations. But underneath the static was something else. A rhythmic pattern like Morse code, but too slow and deliberate to be any communication system I recognized. Long bursts and short bursts with precise pauses between each sequence. I listened for maybe 10 minutes before the line went dead. The next night, it happened again. Same time, 11:47 p.m. Exactly same static, same mysterious pattern. This time, I grabbed a pen and started transcribing the sequences, using dots and dashes like Morse code notation. When I finished, I had 17 lines of seemingly random patterns. But as I stared at the paper, something about the sequences looked familiar. The rhythm reminded me of something I'd learned in wilderness training, a skill that had become second nature after 2 decades of emergency response. They were coordinates. Latitude and longitude, transmitted 1 digit at a time in a pattern that substituted long static bursts for odd numbers, and short bursts for even numbers. It took me 3 hours to decode the full sequence, but when I plotted the location on my topographic map, my blood went cold. The coordinates pointed to a spot 15 miles northeast of my tower, deep in the wilderness area where a 12-year-old boy named Timothy Chen had vanished in 1992. Search teams had combed the area for weeks, but the terrain was too rugged and the forest too dense. They'd never found so much as a piece of clothing. I'd read about the case during my orientation, one of those tragedies that haunted the local rangers, a reminder of how quickly the wilderness could swallow someone without a trace. The third night, I was ready with a digital recorder. The phone rang at exactly 11:47 p.m., and I captured every second of the transmission. When I played it back, the static was clearer, and I could hear something else mixed in with the coordinate sequence. A voice, young male, barely audible beneath the electronic noise. "Help, can't find trails, gone so cold." Timothy Chen had been wearing a bright red jacket when he disappeared. The search teams had focused their efforts on visual scanning, looking for that splash of color against the green and brown of the forest floor. But what if he'd survived the initial disappearance? What if he'd wandered deeper into the wilderness, beyond the search perimeter, and died alone where no one would think to look? The next morning I called Ray Castellanos and requested permission to investigate the coordinates. He was skeptical but agreed to let me take a day hike, provided I carried emergency beacons and checked in every 2 hours. The terrain was brutal, steep ridges, dense stands of lodgepole pine and creek beds choked with deadfall that made navigation a constant struggle. But the coordinates were precise, and my GPS guided me through the maze of ravines and game trails to a small clearing maybe 100 yards across. I found Timothy Chen's campsite under a fallen log. The red jacket was still bright, preserved by the dry mountain air, and protected from scavengers by the log's shelter. Scattered around the makeshift campsite were other artifacts: a water bottle, empty, a small backpack containing candy bars that mice had reduced to foil scraps, and a notebook wrapped in a plastic bag. The notebook was a revelation. Timothy had survived his initial disappearance by almost 2 weeks, living on stream water and huckleberries while trying to find his way back to civilization. His entries started hopeful: careful observations about landmarks and weather, attempts to construct signal markers that searchers might spot from aircraft. But as the days passed, the entries became more desperate. He'd injured his ankle in a fall and could barely walk. He'd lost his compass crossing a stream. Worst of all, he'd realized that he was moving in circles, passing the same landmarks day after day despite his attempts to maintain a straight line. The final entry was dated 14 days after his disappearance. Can hear helicopters, but they're too far away. Tried to make smoke signal, but everything's too wet. If someone finds this, tell mom and dad I tried to get home. Radio in my backpack still works. Maybe someone will hear me calling. Radio. I searched through the scattered gear and found it a small handheld unit, the kind they'd issued to Boy Scout groups in the early 1990s. The battery compartment was corroded, and the antenna was bent, but the frequency dial was still set to the Forest Service emergency channel. The same frequency monitored by the old Forest phone system. That night I sat in the tower with Timothy's radio on the desk beside me, waiting for 11:47 p.m. When the phone rang, I answered it as I had before, but this time I also keyed the radio microphone. Timothy Chen, can you hear me? The static intensified, and through the electronic storm I heard his voice more clearly than ever before. Hello? Is someone there? I've been calling for so long. I can't find my way home. Timothy, you need to listen to me carefully. You got lost in 1992. It's 2023 now. You died out there, son, but somehow you're still trying to call for help. The static faded, and for a moment the line was perfectly clear. When Timothy spoke again, his voice was calm, relieved. I died? That explains why I've been so cold, and why nobody came looking. We did look for you. Hundreds of people searched for weeks. We just didn't find you in time. Will you tell my parents? Tell them I tried to come home? Tell them I wasn't scared at the end? I'll tell them. The static returned, softer now, fading like a radio station disappearing over distance. Timothy's voice came through one last time, barely a whisper. Thank you for answering. Thank you for listening. The line went dead, and I never heard from him again. I hiked back to the campsite the following week with a proper recovery team. We brought Timothy Chen home 31 years after he disappeared, laid him to rest beside his parents who had died still wondering what had happened to their son. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is quiet and the forest holds its breath, I still hear the old forest phone ring. Not Timothy. He's at peace now. But others, lost souls wandering the wilderness, still calling for help on frequencies that officially stopped working decades ago. I answer every call. It's the least I can do. The wildfire had taken everything. Houses, businesses, even the old cemetery on Pine Ridge Road. When I finally returned to Millbrook 6 months later, the town looked like a moonscape. Bare foundations marked where homes had stood, and the surrounding forest was a graveyard of blackened poles that had once been ponderosa pines. But my house had survived. It stood alone in a circle of ash, untouched by flames that had incinerated everything within a half-mile radius. The insurance adjuster called it a miracle, though he couldn't explain why the fire had jumped over my property while consuming houses on both sides. The local fire chief was equally baffled. The wind patterns should have pushed the flames directly through my lot. I should have been grateful, but there was something unsettling about being the only survivor in a neighborhood of ghosts. Especially at night, when the wind stirred the ash into gray clouds that looked like the spirits of everything the fire had claimed. That's when I decided to get a dog. Zeus was a German Shepherd mix, 3 years old, rescued from the same shelter that had housed displaced pets during the evacuation. He'd belonged to the Morrison family before the fire took their house on Deer Creek Road. The whole family had died in their car trying to escape, and Zeus had been found 3 days later, sitting beside the burned wreckage, waiting for them to come back. He was perfect for what I needed: a companion, a protector, something alive to fill the silence that seemed to press in from all sides. The shelter volunteer warned me that he might have trauma-related behavioral issues, but I figured we could work through whatever problems he had. I didn't count on the attic. Zeus settled into the house immediately, claiming the living room couch and following me from room to room, with the devotion that rescue dogs often showed their new families, but he refused to go upstairs. Any attempt to coax him toward the second floor resulted in whimpering, trembling, and a retreat to the furthest corner of the house. The first night I thought it was just adjustment anxiety. New house, new smells, new routines. It would take time for him to feel comfortable in every part of his territory. But on the second night, Zeus planted himself at the bottom of the stairs and started growling. It wasn't the warning growl dogs used for strangers or perceived threats. This was deeper, more primal, the sound of an animal confronting something that violated the natural order. His hackles were raised, his ears pinned back, and his gaze was fixed on a specific point at the top of the stairs. I followed his line of sight but saw nothing except the hallway that led to my bedroom and the pull-down ladder that accessed the attic. "What is it, boy?" I asked, but Zeus just growled louder. The third night, he started barking. It began around midnight, sharp aggressive barks directed at the ceiling above the hallway. I checked the attic with a flashlight but found nothing, just insulation, old Christmas decorations, and the musty smell of a space that hadn't been disturbed in years. But Zeus wasn't satisfied. He paced the upstairs hallway for hours, barking at a specific section of floorboards near the attic access. Even when I pulled down the ladder and showed him the empty space above, he continued his vigilant patrol, convinced that something malevolent was lurking just beyond our perception. By the end of the first week, I was exhausted. Zeus's nighttime barking had become a ritual, starting at exactly 11:30 p.m. and continuing until dawn. The neighbors, what few had returned to rebuild, started complaining. I tried everything. Anxiety medication from the vet, thunder shirts, even bringing Zeus's bed downstairs to keep him away from whatever was triggering his behavior. Nothing worked. If anything, keeping him downstairs made it worse. He would sit at the bottom of the stairs and howl, a mournful sound that made my skin crawl. I was considering returning him to the shelter when I met Mrs. Patterson at the hardware store. She'd lived in Millbrook for 60 years, had seen the town grow from a logging camp to a bedroom community, and had watched the wildfire race most of its history in a single afternoon. "How's that dog working out?" she asked, having heard about Zeus through the small-town gossip network. "He's having some behavioral issues, seems fixated on my attic." Mrs. Patterson's expression darkened. "That house of yours, it belonged to the Hendricks family before you bought it, right?" "That's what the realtor said. Foreclosure sale from about 8 years ago. Tom Hendricks was a strange man. Kept to himself, didn't socialize much, but after his wife died, he got peculiar, started talking about voices in the walls, things moving around upstairs when he was sleeping. A chill ran down my spine. What happened to him? Found him dead in the attic one morning. Heart attack, they said, but he was lying on the floor up there like he'd been trying to get away from something. And here's the odd part, the pull-down ladder was up. No way he could have climbed into the attic and then pulled the ladder up behind him. That night, I decided to camp out in the hallway with Zeus. If something was up there, I wanted to see it for myself. At 11:30 p.m., exactly, Zeus assumed his position near the attic access and began his nightly vigil. But this time, I was listening too, straining to hear whatever had triggered his protective instincts. At first, there was nothing but the usual settling sounds of an old house. Then, around midnight, I heard it. A soft scratching noise from above, like fingernails dragging across wood. Zeus's barking intensified, and I grabbed my flashlight and pulled down the attic ladder. The scratching stopped the moment I started climbing, but I could feel Zeus's anxiety radiating from below, his whimpering growing more desperate as I disappeared into the space above. The attic looked exactly as it had during my previous inspections, empty, dusty, unremarkable. But as I swept my flashlight across the floor, I noticed something I'd missed before. The insulation had been disturbed in a roughly human-shaped pattern, as if someone had been lying there for extended periods. And pressed into the dust were handprints. Dozens of them, scattered across the floorboards in no discernible pattern, but all pointing toward the same spot directly above my bedroom. I followed the trail of handprints to a section where the floorboards had been pried up and hastily replaced. The nails were newer than the surrounding wood, and when I pulled them up with a crowbar I'd brought from downstairs, I found a space that had been hollowed out between the joists. Inside was a collection of items that made my blood freeze. Photographs of me taken through my windows, copies of my mail, even receipts from stores I'd visited since moving to Millbrook. Someone had been watching me, cataloging my routines, preparing for something. At the bottom of the cache was a journal written in Tom Hendricks' handwriting. The entries started normal enough. Complaints about loneliness, grief over his wife's death, difficulty adjusting to life alone. But as the pages progressed, the tone became increasingly paranoid. Something's wrong with the house. I can hear them moving around at night, but when I check, there's nobody there. Found footprints in the dust upstairs, fresh ones, but all the doors were locked. They're in the walls now. I can hear them whispering. They know I know about them. The final entry was dated the day before Hendrix had been found dead. They're not voices in the walls. They're people in the walls. The fire department said everyone in the Carlson house died, but I've seen them moving around up here. They're burned, but they're not dead. They're looking for a new place to live, and they think my house is available. Tonight I'm gonna make sure they understand that it's not. The Carlson house. I remembered seeing the foundation during my walks around the neighborhood. It had been directly behind my property, separated by maybe 50 yards of forest. A family of 4 had died there during the evacuation, trapped when their car wouldn't start. Zeus was barking frantically now, and I could hear his claws scrabbling on the hardwood as he tried to climb the ladder. When I looked down, his eyes were wide with terror, and he was staring at something behind me. I turned and saw them. 4 figures huddled in the far corner of the attic, their bodies twisted and blackened by fire, but their eyes bright with desperate intelligence. The Carlson family still wearing the clothes they died in, still bearing the wounds that had killed them, but somehow still moving, still thinking, still needing shelter from the void that had claimed their home. They weren't malevolent, just lost, confused, looking for warmth and safety in a world that no longer had room for them. Tom Hendrix had found them first, had tried to drive them away, and they'd defended themselves the only way they knew how. Now they were my problem. I backed toward the ladder, but the father, or what remained of him, raised one charred hand in a gesture that might have been pleading. When he spoke, his voice was like wind through burned timber. Please, we just need somewhere to stay, somewhere warm. Zeus's barking had become a howl, a sound of pure anguish that seemed to fill the entire house. I looked down at him and understood what he'd been trying to tell me all week. The dead don't always stay buried, and sometimes the only thing standing between us and them is a good dog with keen instincts and a loyal heart. I climbed down and pulled up the ladder, trapping the Carlson family in the attic where they belonged, but I knew it was only a temporary solution. They'd found a way into Tom Hendricks' house, and they'd find a way into mine. Zeus and I moved out the next morning, and never went back, never tried to sell the house, just walked away and let the bank foreclose again. Let some other family deal with the Carlsons and their need for warmth. But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind sounds like whispers, Zeus still stares at the ceiling and growls. And I know that somewhere, in some attic in some house that survived when others didn't, the Carlson family is still looking for a place to call home. Still waiting for someone who won't try to drive them away. Earl Kowalski had been watching the roads around Pineville for 73 years, first as a schoolboy walking the gravel lanes to the old brick schoolhouse, then as a county maintenance worker keeping those same roads passable through 6 decades of Montana winters. If anyone knew the risk, which was why I believed him when he swore he'd been seeing a school bus that couldn't exist. Every Tuesday, regular as clockwork, Earl told me over coffee at Millie's Diner, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug that had seen better decades. Comes down Highway 47 around 3 in the afternoon, takes the old school road into the hills. Yellow International, just like the ones we used to run. I'd come to Pineville to write a feature story about rural school consolidation, how small towns were losing their identity as local schools closed, and children were bused to distant districts. Earl's stories seemed like colorful local folklore, the kind of detail that would add authenticity to my piece. When did you first notice it? I asked, pen poised. Started maybe 6 months ago. I was fixing washouts on Prospect Road when I seen it coming down the highway. Thought it was maybe bringing kids to visit the old school grounds, you know, some kind of historical field trip. Earl's pale eyes grew distant, but there ain't been children in this town for nigh on 15 years. Pineville's last school had closed in 2008, a victim of declining enrollment and state budget cuts. The children now rode buses 40 miles to the consolidated district in Helena, a journey that took them away from their community for most of each day. The old brick schoolhouse sat empty on School Road, its windows boarded, and its playground slowly being reclaimed by prairie grass. You sure it was a school bus? I pressed. International Harvester, model from the 80s, I'd guess. Yellow as fresh corn, with a fold-out stop sign and the flashers. Driver wore one of them old-style caps, you know, with the bill. Earl paused, studying his coffee. Thing is, I followed it once. Followed it where? Up School Road, far as the pavement goes. But when I got to the schoolhouse, there wasn't no bus there, just the empty building and that old playground equipment rusting in the weeds. Earl's story intrigued me enough to drive out to the schoolhouse that afternoon. The building sat at the end of a half-mile gravel road, a two-story brick structure that had probably been the pride of the community when it was built in 1925. Now it looked like a tomb, its windows covered with plywood and its front steps cracked by decades of freeze-thaw cycles. The playground told its own story of abandonment: swing sets with broken chains, a merry-go-round frozen by rust, monkey bars that had lost half their rungs to time and weather. But what caught my attention was the parking area beside the building. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, too wide and heavy to have been made by a car. School bus tracks. I spent the rest of the afternoon photographing the building and interviewing other longtime residents. Most dismissed Earl's story as senility or wishful thinking, but a few admitted they'd seen glimpses of something yellow moving through the hills on Tuesday afternoons. "Could be the mail truck," suggested Helen Morrison, who ran the post office from her kitchen table. "Sometimes the color plays tricks on you, especially with the afternoon light." But the mail truck was white and it ran on Wednesdays. The following Tuesday, I positioned myself on Highway 47 with a telephoto lens and a clear view of the intersection where School Road branched off toward the hills. At 2:47 p.m. I saw it, a yellow school bus approaching from the south, diesel exhaust shimmering in the autumn air. Through the viewfinder, the bus looked perfectly normal. International Harvester chassis, probably from the mid-1980s, with the distinctive high windows and emergency exits that were standard for the era. The driver was a middle-aged man wearing a uniform cap, and I could see the silhouettes of children in the seats behind him. The bus slowed for the turn onto School Road, its brake lights flashing red as it disappeared into the hills. I waited 5 minutes, then followed in my rental car, dust billowing behind me as I navigated the rutted gravel. The schoolhouse parking area was empty. I checked my watch. Less than 10 minutes had elapsed since I'd seen the bus make the turn. There was nowhere else it could have gone. School Road was a dead end, terminating at the schoolhouse with no other exits or turnoffs. But the building sat silent and abandoned, its boarded windows reflecting my confused face like blind eyes. The tire tracks were still there though. Fresh impressions in the dirt, complete with the distinctive tread pattern of school bus tires. I photographed them from every angle, then spent an hour searching the area for any hidden routes the bus might have taken. Nothing. The bus had simply vanished. That evening, I drove back to town and found Earl at his usual stool at Millie's counter. He took one look at my expression and nodded knowingly. "Saw it yourself, did you?" "I saw something, but it couldn't have been a real bus. There's nowhere for it to go." Earl stirred sugar into his coffee, taking his time before responding. "You know about the fire, don't you?" "What fire?" 1981. Last week of school, spring semester. Bus was bringing the kids home from some kind of award ceremony down in Helena. Driver took a shortcut through the hills. Thought he knew a back way that would save some time. A chill settled in my stomach. What happened? Road was washer than he figured. Bus went off the shoulder, rolled down into Willow Creek. All of them trapped inside when it caught fire. Earl's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. 16 children and the driver. Worst thing ever happened in this county. The bus I saw had children in it. Course it did. Same children. Every Tuesday still trying to get home from that award ceremony. Still taking that shortcut through the hills. I spent the next 2 days at the county courthouse digging through old records and newspaper archives. The Pineville Courier had covered the tragedy extensively. 17 dead in school bus accident. Community mourns young victims. Investigation continues into fatal crash. The details were heartbreaking. 16 students aged 6 to 16 returning from a regional academic competition where Pineville Small School had won several awards. The driver, Frank Morrison, Helen's late husband, had been taking a back road he'd traveled hundreds of times, not knowing that spring runoff had undermined the shoulder. The bus had rolled 3 times before coming to rest in Willow Creek, its fuel tank ruptured and leaking gasoline into the water. The fire had started almost immediately, trapping the passengers inside. By the time rescue crews reached the scene, there was nothing left but charred metal and memories. The accident had effectively killed the town. Enrollment dropped so low that the school closed within 5 years, and families began moving away rather than face the daily reminder of what they'd lost. By 2008, there weren't enough children left to justify keeping the building open. But according to Earl and the evidence of my own eyes, some of those children were still trying to get home. The following Tuesday, I was waiting at the schoolhouse when the bus arrived. It materialized out of the afternoon heat shimmer, like a mirage, becoming real yellow paint gleaming despite 42 years of wear that should have reduced it to rust and memory. Through the windows, I could see the children, 16 young faces pressed against the glass, their eyes bright with excitement over the awards they'd won at the competition. Frank Morrison sat behind the wheel, his uniform cap precisely positioned, his weathered hands steady on the steering wheel, despite the fact that he'd been dead for 4 decades. He looked at me through the windshield and nodded politely, the way small-town drivers acknowledged each other on country roads. The bus pulled into the parking area and stopped, its air brakes hissing in the quiet afternoon. The door folded open with a mechanical wheeze, and I heard the children chattering excitedly about their victories. First place in spelling, second in mathematics, a perfect score on the history quiz. None of them seemed to realize they were dead. "You coming aboard?" Frank asked, his voice carrying the patient authority of a man who'd spent his career safely transporting other people's children. "We're heading home." I knew I should run. Every instinct screamed at me to get back in my car and drive to Helena and never think about Pineville again. But those children looked so hopeful, so proud of their accomplishments, so eager to share their good news with families who had been mourning them for longer than some of them had been alive. "Where exactly is home?" I asked. Frank's smile was infinitely sad. "Same place it's always been, just takes us a little longer to get there now." I climbed aboard. The children welcomed me with the enthusiasm that small-town kids showed to any new face. They told me about their competition, about the other schools they'd beaten, about how proud their parents would be when they heard the news. A few offered to show me their ribbons and certificates, holding up awards that should have burned to ash in 1981. "Are you a reporter?" asked a girl with pigtails and gap-toothed grin. "Are you going to write about us in the newspaper?" "Maybe," I said. "What would you want people to know?" "That we won," shouted a boy from the back. "Tell them Pineville won." Frank put the bus in gear, and we began to move. But instead of following School Road back to the highway, we turned onto a dirt track that I was certain hadn't been there when I'd arrived. The landscape outside the window shifted and blurred, as if we were traveling through time as well as space. Through the dust and heat shimmer, I began to see Pineville as it had been in 1981. The main street bustled with activity. Stores that had been closed for decades displayed fresh merchandise in their windows, and people who had been dead for years waved from their front porches as we passed. "Almost home," Frank announced, and the children cheered. But we never made it. The bus began to slow, its engine coughing and missing, black smoke pouring from the exhaust. Frank pumped the brakes, but I could feel us losing control, the weight of 42 years pressing down like gravity. "Hold on," Frank called, but his voice was already fading, becoming an echo of an echo. The last thing I remember was the sensation of falling, the children's excited chatter dissolving into static, and the smell of smoke that wasn't quite smoke, wasn't quite memory. I woke up in my rental car in the schoolhouse parking lot, slumped over the steering wheel with the sun setting behind the hills. My notebook was open on the passenger seat, filled with quotes and observations I didn't remember writing. "We won. Tell them Pineville won. Same place it's always been. Just takes us a little longer to get there now. Almost home." I left Pineville that night and never went back, but I kept my promise to the gap-toothed girl. I wrote the story, told the world that Pineville had won, that their children had brought home awards that no one would ever forget. And every Tuesday afternoon, no matter where I am, I listen for the sound of diesel engines and children's laughter, hoping that Frank Morrison and his passengers have finally found their way home. The Ozark Trail wound through Mark Twain National Forest, like a snake drunk on moonshine, meandering between limestone bluffs and hidden hollows that hadn't seen human footprints in decades. I'd been hiking solo for 3 days, enjoying the late October solitude and the way the autumn light turned the hardwood canopy into stained glass, which was why the phone was so jarring. It was wedged into the bark of a massive white oak, maybe 8 feet off the trail, the kind of tree that had been standing when Daniel Boone was still getting lost in Kentucky. The phone was an older model iPhone, its screen spider-webbed with cracks and its case scored by what looked like animal claws. The battery compartment was missing entirely, torn away with enough force to expose the internal circuitry to the elements. Rain and humidity had corroded the connections, and the logic board was green with oxidation. By all rights, the device should have been a dead hunk of metal and plastic. But the screen was glowing. I worked the phone free from the bark, noting how deeply it had been driven into the wood, as if someone had hammered it there with desperate force. The screen showed a video in progress, shaky footage shot from someone's perspective as they moved through dense forest. The recording timestamp showed it had been running for 127 hours. More than 5 days of continuous recording on a phone with no battery, capturing footage that couldn't possibly exist. I thumbed the volume up and heard heavy breathing punctuated by the sound of branches breaking and leaves crunching underfoot. The camera jerked and swayed as whoever was holding it pushed through thick undergrowth, occasionally stopping to look over their shoulder. "Come on. Come on," a man's voice muttered. "Where's the damn trail?" The footage looked fresh. Bright autumn colors, clear definition, none of the degradation you'd expect from a device that had been exposed to the elements. But something about the forest in the video seemed wrong. The trees were too dense, the undergrowth too thick, and the light had a strange quality that made everything look slightly underwater. I paused the video and checked the phone's information. The device belonged to someone named Marcus Webb, according to the lock screen. No signal bars, no carrier information, just that impossible battery indicator showing 0%, while the screen continued to glow. When I resumed playback, the pace of the footage had increased. Marcus was moving faster now, crashing through brush with the desperation of someone being pursued. The camera swung wildly as he looked behind him, and I caught glimpses of something moving between the trees, dark shapes that seemed to shift and flow like liquid shadow. "They're getting closer," Marcus whispered, his voice tight with fear. I can hear them breathing. But I couldn't hear anything except his own labored breathing and the sound of his passage through the forest. Whatever he was running from existed only in his perception or in some frequency beyond the phone's ability to record. The video continued for another hour, Marcus's flight becoming increasingly erratic as he lost his way deeper in woods that seemed to grow denser with each frame. He stopped frequently to check his compass, then cursed when it spun without finding magnetic north. "The phone's still recording," he said at one point, speaking directly to the camera. "If something happens to me, tell my family I tried to get home. Tell them I didn't just disappear." That's when I heard my name. It was subtle at first, barely audible beneath Marcus's breathing and the rustle of leaves. But as I listened more carefully, I could make out whispered words. "David, David Chen. Where are you going, David?" My blood went cold. The voice was using my full name, pronouncing it with perfect familiarity, as if whoever was speaking had known me for years. But I'd never heard the voice before, and there was no way Marcus Webb could have known I would find his phone. The recording was addressing me directly. I fast-forwarded through the next several hours, watching Marcus stumble through increasingly alien-looking forest as the light faded toward evening. The whispers grew more frequent, more insistent, always calling my name, always asking where I was going. By the timestamp's final hour, Marcus had collapsed beside a stream that ran black as oil. He was clearly exhausted, possibly hypothermic, and the camera shook in his trembling hands as he made what appeared to be a final video message. "My name is Marcus Webb," he said, staring directly into the lens with eyes that had seen too much. "I've been lost for, God, I don't know how long. Days, maybe weeks. The trails keep changing, and the compass doesn't work, and something's been following me since I left the main path." He paused, listening to sounds I couldn't hear. "If you find this phone, don't try to follow my route. Don't trust the trails. They're not what they seem. The forest, it's alive. It's hungry, and it knows your name." The whispers intensified, and this time they were unmistakably calling for me. "David Chen. David Chen is lost. David needs to come home." Marcus looked up sharply, as if he'd heard something new. "Oh God, they're here. They found me." He pointed the camera toward the tree line, and I saw shapes moving in the darkness, tall, thin figures that seemed to be made of shadow and starlight. "Don't follow the whispers," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "They know your name, but they're not trying to help. They're trying to..." The video cut to black. But the timestamp continued running, showing 127:43:17 and counting upward. The phone was still recording, still capturing something, even though the screen showed nothing but darkness. I should have left the phone where I found it, should have hiked back to my car and reported the discovery to the park rangers. Instead, I found myself studying the final frames of Marcus's footage, trying to identify landmarks that might lead me to where he'd made his last stand. The stream looked familiar. There was a distinctive limestone formation in the background, a natural arch that I'd seen earlier on my hike. If I was right about the location, Marcus had died less than 2 miles from where I was standing. As I studied the video, the whispers started again. "David Chen. Where are you going, David?" But this time, they weren't coming from the phone speakers. They were drifting through the forest around me, carried on a wind that made the leaves whisper my name with perfect pronunciation. I looked up from the screen and realized I was no longer alone on the trail. The shadows between the trees had deepened, taking on the suggestion of human shapes. They were tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that bent in directions that hurt to look at. When they moved, they flowed like water, never quite solid, never quite real. But they knew my name. "David Chen is lost," they whispered in voices like autumn leaves. "David needs to come home. David should follow us." I backed away, clutching Marcus Webb's phone like a talisman. The screen had begun recording again, showing my own face twisted with fear as I retreated down the trail. But in the background of the footage, I could see the shadow figures moving closer, reaching out with appendages that stretched like taffy across impossible distances. "Don't run, David. Running only makes it worse." Marcus ran, and look what happened to Marcus. I ran anyway. I crashed through the forest with Marcus's desperation, branches tearing at my clothes and roots trying to trip me with every step. Behind me, the whispers grew into a chorus, dozens of voices calling my name, telling me to stop, telling me to come home. But I knew it wasn't my home they were leading me to. The trail seemed to shift beneath my feet, familiar landmarks disappearing and new paths opening where none had existed before. My compass spun wildly, and my GPS showed nothing but static. The forest was alive, just as Marcus had said, reshaping itself to prevent my escape. I finally collapsed beside a stream that ran black as oil, the same stream where Marcus had made his final recording. The phone in my hand was still capturing footage, still documenting my flight through the impossible woods. And as I stared at the screen, I saw my own terrified face reflected back at me, with dark shapes gathering just over my shoulder. "Welcome home, David," the whispers said. "Welcome home." The recording timestamp showed 149:17:33 and climbing. I'd been lost for 22 hours now, and the phone is still recording, still capturing my stumbling progress through forest that changes with each step, still documenting my conversations with shadows that know my name. If you find this phone, don't try to follow my route, don't trust the trails, and whatever you do, don't listen when they start whispering your name. They know who you are, they've been waiting for you, and they're very, very hungry. The first thing I noticed about Millfield wasn't the boarded up storefronts or the rusted out cars scattered like grave markers across front yards. It was the silence. Even the wind seemed muted here, as if the hollow between these ancient Appalachian ridges swallowed sound whole. Uncle Ray met me at what used to be the main drag, a cracked strip of asphalt flanked by buildings that looked like they'd been slowly dissolving for decades. His handshake was firm, but his eyes held that hollow look I'd seen in too many men who'd watched their world disappear, one factory closure at a time. "Appreciate you coming out, Danny," he said, leading me toward a rust-eaten pickup. "No, it ain't much of a vacation." The farmhouse sat at the base of Old Garrow Hill, like a tumor. White clapboard siding had grayed to the color of dirty snow, and the wraparound porch sagged under the weight of rotting timber. Ray had inherited it from his wife's family, a place nobody wanted but nobody could afford to abandon. Been in the family since 1923, Ray explained as we unloaded my tools. Built it right after they sealed up the old mine shafts. Coal company went bust, left the mountain looking like Swiss cheese. The basement reeked of mildew, and something else, something acrid that burned the back of my throat. Ray's flashlight beam danced across stone walls slick with condensation, revealing the source of our problem, a jagged crack running floor to ceiling, weeping rusty water onto the concrete. "Started about 6 months ago," Ray said. "Right after Martha passed. Funny timing, you ask me." I was running my hand along the fissure when my fingers found empty space. Behind a loose stone, maybe 2 feet square, was darkness. Ray's light revealed rough-hewn walls extending beyond our beam's reach. "Well, I'll be damned," Ray muttered. "Must be one of them old coal tunnels." But as we pulled away more stones, the acrid smell intensified. The tunnel walls weren't just dark, they were black, as if scorched by tremendous heat. I scraped at the surface with my knife, and charcoal flaked away in my palm. "Coal don't burn like that," I said. Ray's face had gone pale. Maybe we should seal this back up. That first night, I woke to the sound of something sliding across concrete. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m., its green glow, the only light in the farmhouse's oppressive darkness. I crept downstairs, barefoot on cold linoleum, and descended to the basement. The tunnel opening gaped wider than before. A thin trail of fresh soil led from the mouth toward the basement stairs, as if something had been dragged or had dragged itself partway out before retreating. In the morning, I found Ray sipping coffee with shaking hands. "You hear anything last night?" I asked. "Nothing but wind," he said too quickly. I spent the day researching at the county courthouse. The mine records were spotty, but what I found made my skin crawl. The Garrow Hill operation had closed suddenly in 1923. After a series of incidents, 7 miners had gone missing in the deepest shafts. Search teams reported finding evidence of extreme heat, melted support beams, vitrified rock, but no bodies. More disturbing were the newspaper clippings. For months after the mine closure, residents reported strange sounds from beneath their homes. Scratching, sliding, the sound of something heavy being pulled through narrow spaces. That night I waited in the basement with Ray's shotgun across my knees. At 3:17 a.m. exactly, I heard it, a wet, grinding sound from deep within the tunnel, like massive millstones turning. The scorched walls seemed to pulse with each grinding revolution. Something was coming closer. I aimed my flashlight into the tunnel and saw them parallel grooves in the charred stone, worn smooth by decades of passage. Whatever had been emerging night after night was large enough to leave furrows a foot wide in solid rock. The grinding stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard breathing that wasn't mine. "Danny?" Ray's voice drifted down from upstairs, but it sounded wrong, stretched thin like he was calling from a great distance. I climbed the basement stairs and found the kitchen empty. The front door hung open, spilling cold mountain air across the threshold. Ray's coffee cup sat steaming on the table, as if he'd just stepped away. "Ray," I called into the darkness. His voice answered from the basement. "Down here, Danny. Come see what I found." But Ray was outside somewhere. I was sure of it. I had just watched his empty kitchen, seen his abandoned coffee. The voice called again, patient and familiar. "Come on down, son. Don't want to keep it waiting." I stood at the top of the basement stairs, shotgun trembling in my grip, and realized the voice was coming from the tunnel. Not Ray's voice, something else. Something that had been listening to our conversations, learning the cadences and inflections of human speech. Something that had been practicing. Through the kitchen window, I saw movement on Old Garrow Hill. A figure stumbled between the bare trees, moving with the jerky gait of a marionette. Even at this distance, I recognized Ray's flannel shirt, his silver hair catching moonlight. But Ray was calling to me from the basement, his voice growing more insistent. "Danny, you need to see this. It's beautiful down here. Martha's here too. She's been waiting." I ran. I left everything, tools, clothes, Ray's truck keys, and sprinted down the gravel road until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. When I finally looked back, the farmhouse was dark except for a faint orange glow seeping through the basement windows. The next morning, state police found me babbling beside the highway. They drove me back to the farmhouse, where they discovered the basement tunnel had collapsed, sealing itself with tons of stone and earth. Ray was never found. The official report cited a gas leak explosion, but I know better. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that grinding sound closer now, as if the thing beneath Old Garrow Hill has learned to travel farther from home. And sometimes, in the space between sleep and waking, I hear Ray's voice calling my name, asking why I left him behind.